Thanks so much for having me. This is so much fun. One of the things, one of the nice things about technology and the world these days is that people are much more likely to say, hey, you can't actually come all the way over here, but would you like to do something online? And that's really fun for me because I get to talk with all different kinds of communities. So thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. We're going to be talking today. I'm going to share a little bit with you about my story and my life, and we're going to talk a little bit about trans folks, gender expansive folks, some of the language around these communities, and then some things that you can do to support your trans and gender expansive siblings. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully that will all work out okay. Hold on. All right, fingers crossed that's coming through all right. So I'll start out by just telling you a little bit about myself and my experiences and like why I do this work, where I'm coming to it from. It's helpful for folks to have a sense of who's speaking and why they're talking about this stuff and why it's important to them. So let me tell you a little bit about my life. This is a picture of me and my sisters. I'm the one all the way over on the left. When I was born, I was assigned female at birth. I'm a transgender guy, and so what that means for my experience is that I was assigned female at birth, but I then eventually got to kind of say psych to everybody growing up, and got to share more about my gender identity and my experience of my gender. But I grew up for a long time with everybody thinking that I was a girl. And so that was kind of my one of the main experiences of my childhood. Another main experience of my childhood was growing up in a very evangelical, very conservative, theologically conservative, and politically conservative family, and being homeschooled for the first, 5 grades, five years in school. And so my experience of Christianity was very much through an evangelical lens for the first few years of my life. And so that, came with a lot of things. It came with some really good things, like really internalizing sort of like Jesus loves me and like that sort of language, and memorizing a lot of Bible verses. I did a lot of Bible memorization growing up, and those stuck with me, and I appreciate that. But there was also some not so great stuff about growing up in that particular Christian subculture. And one of the things that was not so great is that it was very heavy on gender roles and gendered expectations. So women were supposed to do some things, men were supposed to do other things. There was a heavy insistence on sort of the complementarity of men and women, meaning that only certain people can do certain things, and that's why you need both, which then can lean into things like homophobia, because then if you think like all relationships have to be a man and a woman, then that's like a whole nother thing. So there was a lot of that was not so great about growing up in those circles. So this was my kind of experience growing up. And this is a photo when I think about myself as a kid, and I think about like, me as a kid prior to like puberty and like growing up into adulthood. I look at this picture of me and I think, yes, that's me. I can kind of see myself in that photo. Whereas it's a lot more difficult to see myself in some of the photos where, say, I'm, dressed up for Christmas or Easter or something, and I'm wearing a dress. When I look back at this photo of me playing baseball, I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. I can see me there. So despite having these sort of rigid gender roles and gender expectations in this community I grew up in, thankfully my mom kind of allowed some pushback to what was allowed for kids. So for me, I was allowed to cut my hair short. I was allowed to it's within sort of Western society. We have this concept of like the tomboy, which I don't know if it's as sort of relevant or used as a term in the UK as it is in the US, but like we have some understanding for people who we think are female who maybe have more masculine characteristics. Like we don't like, we kind of have an understanding of that. Whereas it's a lot harder for folks who are assigned male at birth to express more feminine characteristics without being heavily ridiculed in our society. So for me, it was kind of like, all right, I kind of have this loophole of like tomboy where I can kind of be myself and it's kind of okay as long as I don't step over too many lines, especially in church. So as I grew up and experienced puberty and like that was really the time for me when something called dysphoria hit, or which we're going to talk a little bit about. But this experience of your body changing, not just like in the normal stressed out teenager way of like, my body's changing, oh no, this is terrible, but specifically when your body is changing and going through a puberty that is not the right one for you, that can be very distressing. And so for me, part of what I figured out as I then started going to regular school here in the U.S. in late middle school and high school, and started kind of like trying to figure myself out. I realized that there were certain sort of subcultures within our culture that allowed for more gender expression, more diverse gender expression. So for me, what that meant was really getting goth when I got into high school, because there was a lot more room for self-expression in that particular subculture. So this is a photo, pretty grainy photo of me in high school. This was early on in the goth phase. You can see I was not going in all black at this point, but that did happen later on. But for me, it was like finding sort of a group of folks for whom gender expression could be a little bit more fluid. And that was helpful for me as I was growing up. It was also around this time in high school, early high school, where I started thinking, I don't know if Christianity is for me. And part of it, like a lot of it, was dealing with those strict gender requirements and expectations. But it was also kind of coming to see a lot of, I think, teenagers are especially good at sniffing out like hypocrisy and figuring out when people aren't walking the walk. And for me, seeing, like, growing up with this theology that said like God loves everybody, but this sort of God loves everybody but theology. God loves everyone except if you do these specific things, then God's going to be really angry at you. If you do these specific things, you're going to hell. You can never come back from that. This sort of theology didn't make sense to me. It felt like saying that certain people, and then just sort of like the larger issue of like, well, depending on whether you're Christian or not, that can depend on just like where you live in the world. Like some people aren't Christian, some people are members of other faiths, and like, does that mean they're going to hell? So I had a lot of these questions, and I started thinking like, oh, okay, Christianity, I don't think this is for me. So I did a lot of sort of looking into different world religions and different faith systems, which really brought a better understanding of like other people in the world. Because I grew up in a town where everybody was Christian. I knew one Jewish person, that was it. But everybody was Christian, and almost everybody, well, yeah, it was like, 75, 80% of the population was Protestant of some variety. And so I grew up in a very sort of homogenous space theologically. So bringing all this together, I kind of said, I don't think Christianity is for me. I think maybe I want to take a step away from this. And so I was allowed to do that because in high school, early high school, late middle school, early high school, my parents got divorced. And at that point, my mom sort of stopped going to church, and my dad got way more into church and way more sort of theologically conservative than he already was. And so because of that, because I lived most of the time with my mom, I was allowed to kind of stop going to church and take a little bit of a break from Christianity, which was really necessary for me at that point. Because like pushing back against it and saying like, you have to go anyway, would have basically been the worst thing that my parents could have done, I think, at that point. So I had this experience through high school and then into college. And in college, I here's me doing my best to try to be feminine there. You can see it wasn't totally working out for me. Um, During college, I got to study abroad. I got to do a couple of different trips outside the US, which was really helpful in like broadening my understanding of how people exist in the world. Um, but I also started thinking about Christianity and being curious about Christianity from more of an academic perspective, which allowed me a little bit of distance. Rather than thinking about it as like, this is a belief system that I have that could crumble if anything like touches it, I started thinking about Christianity as something that was more that I could like study from a little bit of a distance, that I could ask some really like deep and searching questions about that wouldn't, the whole house of, if the whole house of cards fell down, then I wouldn't, I wasn't part of it. I could be like a little bit outside of it. It felt like it was a little bit more of a thing I could engage with that way. And as I did that, I found that there were more and more things about Christianity that I really, one that I really cared about and that resonated with me and that had stuck with me from my childhood. And two, I realized that there were other ways of being Christian. So in high school, I had started going to a church a couple of times with a friend of mine who I had a crush on. And so I was like, okay, I'll just do whatever you want me to do. And I started going to this church that was much more theologically progressive. And that was my first like, wow, there are other kinds of Christians out there. What on earth? I'd never heard of these people. And so then in college, kind of again, going to different churches and going to experience like churches that were, first of all, open and affirming and welcoming of LGBT people. That was huge for me. I didn't know that was possible to be Christian and LGBT affirming. But also like people that just had a more expansive theology about like what God was doing in the world and what our role in that might be as human beings. So got a little bit back into Christianity in college, and then as I finished college and then was kind of like trying to figure out what the next thing was that I wanted to do, I got more and more and more into thinking about faith and theology. So this is a picture of me and my partner. Actually, this is, gosh, we look like babies. This was like 10 years ago now. But coming like out of college and then trying to figure out what I wanted to how I wanted to sort of move into my field of study, and realizing like I really have more questions about faith. I want to go find out more about faith and more about Christianity specifically. So I ended up going to seminary, and while I was in seminary, I started out in youth and family ministry. That was what I thought I was going to do. And I learned pretty quickly that what I actually wanted to do was study scripture. Like working with the youth was really fun, but what I wanted to do was learn how to translate scripture from like Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and like learn how to do these things and think about scripture. And so as I got into that, I realized that part of the reason it was so important for me was because it was like figuring out how to reclaim the first inroad that I had to Christianity, Bible memorization and like scripture being the main thing that stuff revolved around when I was younger. I wanted to figure out how I could understand scripture in a like, where were all these progressive Christians getting their theology, right? Like they were reading the Bible differently than I had read the Bible, than my family had read the Bible when I was growing up. And so that was what I was really getting into, was trying to figure out how to read the Bible in a different way. And not just like for the sake of being different, but wondering like, can we legitimately read the Bible this way? So that was what I was getting into in seminary. And as I was doing that, at the same time I was doing that, I was really trying to figure out what the heck was going on with my gender, because I knew that something was up and had known for a while, but didn't really know what it was. And it wasn't until I was in seminary that I was like, okay, I have recently found out that transgender people exist. And now I suddenly have like some language to explain how I'm feeling and what I experience. And like figuring out the language was one thing, accepting that about myself was a whole other thing. And then coming out and like talking to people about that was a whole other thing. And especially because I was in seminary, and I was at a seminary where like there were LGBT students. There weren't any other trans. There was one other trans student that I knew of, but they were at this school on like a exchange program, and so they weren't having to graduate from this school. And so I was nervous that if I came out as trans, they wouldn't let me graduate because they weren't like officially affirming. That was just sort of the mood around campus. And so I ended up coming out as trans right after I graduated. So this is me graduating, getting my little master's certificate and my hood and everything. And like basically right after this, I came out, and like everybody knew at this point. Like I wore a suit to my graduation, and I like people knew, but it wasn't something that I made super public just because I wasn't sure if they were going to let me graduate, and I didn't want to mess that up because I cared a lot about it. So post graduation, I started working specifically in and with trans Christian communities because that was really where my heart was. And it was really the thing that I cared about. And I got to, thankfully, continue that work. I graduated in 2014, and I've been continuing that work since, working with different communities and getting to teach at churches, and then getting to speak and getting to write. And then recently, right with the pandemic, we started Transmission Ministry Collective, which is a community online that is for trans and gender expansive Christians. And so getting to be a part of that and serve as the director has been a real wonderful ride so far. So that's the work that I do now, is kind of working to support trans and gender expansive Christians and working to help Christian communities understand trans experiences. And of course, I can only speak to my specific experience and speak out of my specific experience. But there are ways that I hope that we can sort of bring in other voices that can speak to the range of trans experiences that there are, because there's no one singular trans experience. So having said all that, having shared about that, let's just talk a little bit about what it means to be trans, and like what are the words that we're using? How might we use them better? How do we understand our trans neighbors? So I want to just quickly make a distinction here between orientation and gender. Orientation, also called your sexuality, your sexual orientation, your affectional orientation, that describes the gender of people that you are attracted to, and that's internal to you. Nobody else can see it. So there are lots of different orientations, but that's all about who you're attracted to, right? We make those sort of internal attractions visible through affectional behavior, which can be personal things, small personal things, or it can be big social traditions, right? But orientation is a separate thing from gender. So orientation is kind of like one circle, gender is another circle. And then if you can think of it as a Venn diagram, I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about these things, because there is some overlap, but they're different. So when we're talking about gender, there's lots of different ways that we have figured out how to describe gender. And so there are lots of different models for this. This model comes out of the work of Gender Spectrum, which is an organization out of San Francisco. But talking about gender as something that has biological, psychological, and sociological elements to it, biopsychosocial as a big compound word, is a way that can kind of encompass what we mean when we talk about gender. So we can think about gender as having these three different facets. There's one facet, which is your body. And you can see here in my little stick figure, it's pointing between this little stick figure's legs. And that's because that's when people talk about the biological parts of gender, usually what they're talking about is your external reproductive organs. That's the thing that they're concerned about. But that's not all that goes into this factor. You also have your internal reproductive organs, your chromosomes, your hormone levels, and then brain matter, because there's some differences in brain matter too, depending on your gender. So there's lots of things that happen with your body when it comes to gender and how that works. We have sometimes made a distinction between this factor and the next one, which is your gender identity, your internal self-perception of your gender. We've sometimes made a distinction between these two by calling the body part sex and calling the gender identity part gender. But one of the things that we've kind of come to realize is that that language might not be as helpful in helping people figure this out, because these two things are different. Your like what your body is like and how you know yourself, those are different things. But they're a little bit more wrapped up in each other than we'd like to admit sometimes. So for instance, your gender identity is how you understand yourself, right? And that happens in your brain, but your brain is part of your body and it's affected by things like hormone levels. And so there are this way of understanding gender that sort of talks about these three different factors. It helps us think about how they interact with each other, but it also helps us understand how they are different. So the third one here is gender expression, which is the way that you show your gender to others through things like clothing, hair, mannerisms that have gendered expectations or gendered values in your particular society. And that can include the gender roles that you take on. So you've got your body, right? And the main thing people are concerned about is your external reproductive organs, but that's not the whole story. And then you got your gender identity, which is how you understand yourself. And you got your gender expression, which is how you express yourself. So these three things, they all sort of go together and interact with each other in very complex ways. So as I said, and as I said earlier, when I said that I was assigned female at birth, we might sometimes talk about the body part of the equation as somebody's assigned sex, or assigned gender sometimes. So the language is sort of evolving as we try to figure out the best ways to explain to people what's going on here. But assigned sex, that is the way that your body is assigned based basically almost always on just your external reproductive organs at or before birth. So if you have an ultrasound, you'll get that. But that's all they're looking at is your external reproductive organs. And the reason that that is not a 100% great way of gendering a body, even before we get to your identity, is because while most people are endosex, meaning that they have all sex characteristics that can be clearly assigned as male or female, about 1.7% of the population is intersex, meaning they have differences in sex development. So these are folks for whom they may have internal and external reproductive organs that are different. So you may see, a baby might be born with one set of external reproductive organs, and you think, oh, it's a boy, only to find out that they have internal ones that are different, or their chromosomes are different, or their hormone receptors work differently. So one of the differences in sex development or sex variations that we see is something called androgen insensitivity, which is when somebody has XY chromosomes, but their body develops in what we would think of as a stereotypically feminine way because their body can't actually process things like testosterone, androgens. So they have like the genetic code to produce that, but their body doesn't receive it. And so these folks are often assigned female and raised as female. And for many of them, they live their lives usually up until puberty, not knowing that they are intersex. And it's usually around puberty that intersex folks find out that they're intersex if they have some difference that makes puberty go differently for them. But intersex folks and intersex variations are a lot more common than we think. So it's important to think about ways that we can, as when we're thinking about gender diversity, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about trans folks, thinking about physical diversity, body diversity, sex diversity, thinking about standing with intersex folks is also very important as well. So when we're talking about transgender people, transgender is an umbrella term. So it encompasses many different identities underneath, but all of these have to do with having a gender identity that is different from the sex you were assigned at birth, having a gender identity that is different from your body and what people expected of your body. So the word cisgender is used to refer to people who have a gender and an assigned sex that match. So cis and trans are both just Latin prefixes. Trans means across from, like transatlantic, and cis means on the same side. So are your gender identity and your assigned sex, are they on the same sort of plane or are they different, right? That's kind of what these words are asking or saying. So there's lots of folks that fall under this umbrella. So you've got transgender men, who are folks like myself who are assigned female at birth but know themselves to be male. You've got trans women, so somebody who are assigned male at birth but knows themselves to be female. You've got non-binary folks. So non-binary folks have a gender identity that doesn't conform to the male-female binary. They may feel like a combination of male and female, or they may identify as a completely different gender altogether. So sometimes people are kind of stumped by the idea of like non-binary genders. So non-binary, it means like not just male or female, right? But it's not exactly, how do I explain this? One of my friends who is non-binary once explained it to me like this. They said, all right, so we've done really well working from, like, we've moved from a two-box system of male and female to talking about gender as a spectrum, right? So we've kind of got like a spectrum from here to here now. So that's better than two boxes, right? But they said, the problem with trying to explain how people work in a two-dimensional framework is that we are three-dimensional people. And anytime you try to describe us in a two-dimensional way, you are flattening out difference. And so they said, think about it like this. When you look at the night sky and you see a constellation, you look at the constellation and you go, okay, I can like see the picture, right? You can see it. And it looks two-dimensional to you because you're looking up at this thing that looks like it's almost like against a black sky, right? So it looks two-dimensional to you. But in reality, those stars are way far apart from each other in three-dimensional space. And they said, so think about it this way. If male is here and female is here, I'm over here as a non-binary person. And that might look like it's in the middle of a spectrum, but it's over here, right? It's a different thing. And that I thought was a really interesting way of explaining what non-binary is. So for some folks, thinking they do understand themselves as sort of a mix of male and female, but for other people, they're like, no, like this male and female identification, that doesn't make sense of my gender. So I'm a different thing when it comes to gender. So non-binary folks, agender folks may have a sense of gender, may not have a sense of gender identity, or may only experience their gender occasionally. So for these folks, gender is just not a way of how they understand themselves. It's just not relevant to them and their experience. Gender fluid folks may experience their gender as something that changes over time, and that can be over short periods or long periods of time. And then gender queer folks, gender queer is a fascinating word in the same way that queer is a fascinating word, because of course it's something that some people experienced as a slur and other people experience as incredibly liberating. It also is super expansive in what it can mean. So some genderqueer people may use this term to sort of intentionally allow for ambiguity, to kind of say like, you have to get to know me to know what this means to me. And other people use it as a way to mark their sort of intentional disruption of the gender binary. So for some folks, saying that you're genderqueer is not just like describing your gender, but it's also saying like, and I'm intentionally pushing back against sexism and misogyny and like the way that gendered systems in the world set some people up for oppression. So genderqueer is a fascinating word, and it's really one of those things where you can never totally know what it means to the person unless you talk to them. And I mean, that's true for all of these words, right? Like all of these words have variations, and they're all going to be different to different people. But I think genderqueer, just like the word queer, is like one that is especially because it has a history of being used as a slur at times, being sort of aware of that as we're using it, and to be specific about like not using that word for people who we don't know that they use it for themselves, right? If they use it for themselves, awesome. If it's part of a academic field of study like queer theory, awesome. But thinking about just like keeping in mind that some people may have had a negative experience with it, especially folks who are older. So when you think about what trans looks like and like who are these people, this is just sort of a compilation of different trans folks, some of them pretty famous, some of them pretty well known, some of them not so well known. But thinking about like when we think about what does it look like to be trans, there is no one way to be trans, and there's no one way to look trans. Just keeping in mind that like the expectations that we have or the stereotypes that we have are usually wrong for most groups of people, but especially I think for this group because it's incredibly diverse. So when we're talking about trans people, transgender is an adjective or a descriptive word. So you would say somebody is a transgender person, not just a transgender. And this is something that happens a lot when people are like, I don't really know how to use this, but it's a descriptive word. So it describes a person. And there's also no need to add an ED on the end of it for transgendered. That's something that you'll see even in stuff written about trans folks like, I don't know, 10 years ago. You'll still see the ED on the end, and that's mostly been changed now, but because people kind of realize like that doesn't make sense as a descriptive word. But it also makes it sound like something terrible happened to you to make you trans, that you got transgendered somehow. And so that's not how that works. And so we kind of realized, all right, take that ED off the end. So transgender as a descriptive word, you don't need the ED. So couple terms to be careful with. One is transsexual, and this word is still like used and preferred by some trans folks, but largely it has been replaced by transgender or just trans. And the reason for that, the reason we have kind of this distinction between transgender and transsexual is transsexual has been specifically used to describe people who have medically transitioned, and not all trans people medically transition. And so transgender, meaning you have a gender that is different from your assigned sex, is a much wider sort of umbrella than transsexual. And so that's why a lot of people prefer it. But there are some trans folks for whom the word transsexual is like, no, that's my word. I fought for that. That's mine. That's how I describe myself. In which case, awesome, go for it. So there's some sort of like conversation about like the necessity or not of medical transition that happens within trans communities. So that's something to be aware of. Sex change is another sort of phrase that folks were much more, that showed up a lot in the press, especially years ago, and still occasionally today. But nowadays we talk about people having gender affirming surgery, or if somebody is changing the way they are medically or socially, changing the way they're perceived medically or socially, we say that person is transitioning. So talking about transition or transitioning is the main way that people talk about this now. So let's talk a little bit about what transition actually is. Trans people, lots of trans people experience this thing called gender dysphoria. And I mentioned it earlier in terms of like my story and being a teenager. Gender dysphoria is the distress or dissonance caused by the difference between one's gender and one's assigned sex. So the best way I can describe it for me is nails on a chalkboard, but like internally. Like you have this internal nails on a chalkboard feeling when people perceive you in a way that is not you. So when people assume your gender, when people use the wrong words to describe you or the wrong name to talk to you, this feeling of like internal nails on a chalkboard, like that's not right. It's like a, I don't know exactly how to explain it, because it's not like somebody's just done something that's one of your pet peeves. Like this is like an ontological thing that's going on. So gender dysphoria, right? But not all trans people experience gender dysphoria, and not all people experience it at the same sort of rate or amount. So gender dysphoria is something that lots of trans people do experience, but it's not like a requirement to be trans. There's no, I have a great book called the Trans Affirming Workbook, coloring book. I forget exactly what it's called. It's great. But it has a one page that says there is no minimum amount of suffering required to be trans. And I think that's a great way of putting it. So Thinking about gender dysphoria, lots of people will transition to lessen gender dysphoria so that they can be themselves, to move towards euphoria, right? So people may choose social transition, which can include things like changing their name and their pronouns, changing clothing, hairstyle, other forms of gender expression. Those are all social transition pieces. You might choose medical transition, which can include things like hormone replacement therapy or gender affirmation surgery or voice therapy, things that medically change your body. Voice therapy is kind of on the edge of a social transition versus medical transition thing. And then legal transition, which might include changing name and gender markers on major documents. So all of these things are possible for folks in varying degrees depending on where you live. Some places it's much harder to do these things, some places it's a little bit easier. And there are places, because of the way medical systems work, both in the UK and the US, there are times when one thing of these is required before you're allowed to do other things, which makes it especially difficult for trans people. So for instance, sometimes there will be a requirement that you socially transition and be socially transitioned for a year before you're allowed to medically transition. Sometimes there are requirements that you have to have surgery before you're allowed to change your documents. So there are things that like set up, they're like things set up to require other pieces of this, which is not great because some people only want like one or two of these things and they don't want all of them, to sort of be able to be seen and understood in the world as themselves. So that's not a great system that we've got so far. It's also important to say that not all trans people transition. For some people, it's enough to know that their gender identity is different from what people expect, and they don't need to transition. They don't feel that need. So knowing that that is not a requirement for being transgender. So here's where it gets a little bit complicated, if it's not complicated already. Being transgender is not a mental illness. Period. That's agreed upon by the World Health Organization. It's agreed upon by lots of major health organizations. However, the problem is if you want to medically transition in many places, you are required to have a diagnosis in order to medically transition. And that's where this gets to be a real mess. For a long time, diagnostic manuals for mental health had gender identity disorder in the manual as something you could be diagnosed with, which was essentially diagnosing you as trans. So they considered it a mental health disorder in the same way that being gay was considered a mental health disorder for a really long time. And then they realized like, oh, hang on a sec, this is just normal human diversity. So in recent versions of diagnostic manuals, they've changed it. So in the DSM in the US, they changed it in 2013. Oop, hold on, I think my headphones just died. Wait for it. I have to change these out. Sorry, folks.
Can't hear you. Did you freeze? Tech. What just happened there? Oh, I think you're back. Talk. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, say something else.
How about now?
Does that sound clear? Not sure. Kind of in and out. Just keep talking. We'll see how it goes.
You should be on the right settings now.
A little bit quiet. We'll try to turn you up here.
Okay, sorry about that. My headphones just died all of a sudden, which is the benefit of wireless headphones, is sometimes they just die. There we go. Hopefully that'll work. So the issue is that we had this diagnosable thing that was essentially diagnosing you with being transgender, right? And then in 2013, the DSM in the US changed and said, we're actually going to change this so that the thing that we are diagnosing you with is gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is like, essentially what they're trying to do is have the diagnosis be a symptom rather than an actual illness. So they changed that in 2013 in the US. And then the World Health Organization changed in 2019, and they changed gender identity disorder to gender incongruence. So that's probably what you would get diagnosed with if you're in the UK. And it's the same thing, right? The same idea here is that like you are experiencing your gender differently from your assigned sex, and that is causing you distress, right? So that's what we're trying to help people deal with. It's like, it's the distress that is a problem, but the distress is not inherent in being trans. And so like, that's part of what the complicating factor is here. So thinking about all of this, the important thing to remember is that gender change efforts don't work. Because a lot of people will say, well, if this is such a problem, why don't you just change your brain to fit your body rather than changing your body to fit your brain? And I guess that would be nice, except for it doesn't happen. It doesn't work. All major organizations for mental health agree that this is the case. According to the World Professional Association for Trans Health, they've kind of said like, okay, we've tried this, it doesn't work, right? It's been attempted in the past without success, particularly in the long term, and such treatment is no longer considered ethical. There was a study in 2019 that looked at 27,000 transgender folks, and they found that people who had been exposed to conversion therapy efforts were twice as likely to attempt suicide in their lifetime. And if they experienced this before the age of 10, they were 4 times as likely to experience suicide or to attempt suicide. So the problem is like, we know that gender change efforts don't work, and we know that transitioning and allowing people to transition does work. So there you go. That's like where the science is at right now, right? It's also important to know that gender diversity is not new. This is not like a new thing that just popped up overnight. We have lots of stories of gender diverse and gender expansive folks throughout history. So these are just 2 folks that I find their stories are really interesting. Albert Cashier was a soldier in the Civil War here in the US. He fought on the right side, on the correct side, so that's good, the side that was against slavery. But he was assigned female at birth, but lived most of his life as male and fought in the Civil War. And then this is Huehua, who was a person from the Zuni people of New Mexico, which is an indigenous tribe or nation in the United States. And was the first out gender diverse person to meet a US president in 1886. And so these folks are, it's like, we've known about gender expansive folks for a long time. They're in our history books. A lot of times they are misgendered and misnamed in our history books, or they're excluded from our history books, but they do exist. It's also, I think, really important to mention and note that white supremacy and colonialism have tried to erase gender diversity. So, for instance, when the conquistadors came to the New World, they came to Central and South America, they met Native folks and Native communities and indigenous communities who had a lot more gender diversity, but these folks who were colonizing did not know what to do with that, right? So Balboa came over in 10, I think, when he came over, but he came to Panama, what is now today Panama, and met the Cueva people. And the Cueva people had a whole group of folks in their community that didn't identify as just male or just female. And Balboa didn't know what to do with them because, coming from a strict Catholic background, he had no framework for that. And so he labeled them as sodomites and then killed them. And so, like, this is a thing that happens over and over in the world, where colonizing forces that don't have a concept of gender diversity show up and say, you're not allowed to do this anymore. And that's often because the winners write history books, we often don't find out about these things. So we also have some gender diversity in Christian history, right? So I love this story. Marius the monk in what is today Syria in the 5th century started presenting as male to join a monastery with his father. And what happened was Marius was asked by the father of the monastery, what would that be? The abbot of the monastery, to go on a trip as an adult, right? So Marius grows up in this monastery. His father dies. Nobody knows that Marius was assigned female at birth by the time he's an adult. And the abbot says, "Well, you go on this trip to this other abbey," and he does. And when he comes back, he is accused by a local innkeeper's daughter of getting her pregnant, like on the trip and back. And rather than saying, as Marius could have said, like, "Well, I probably couldn't have done that," probably not something that I actually did. Instead of that, Marius kept being himself and was kicked out of the abbey, and took care of this child, and eventually petitioned the abbot to let him back into the abbey. And so then he ended up going back to the abbey with this boy that he raised as his son for the rest of his life. And nobody found out until he died that he had been assigned female at birth. So Marius, as this monk who took care of this child his whole life, is a pretty awesome story of fatherhood. There's also the story of Madre Juana de la Cruz in the 15th century in Spain. So during the Spanish Inquisition, she was one of the only women allowed to preach during that time, which is pretty wild. She insisted her whole life that the Virgin Mary had intervened to change her from a boy into a girl while in the womb, pointing to her large Adam's apple as proof. She had several different more masculine physical characteristics. And of course, scholars look back today and they say, well, she was probably intersex, but we don't know. But she dressed in both masculine and feminine clothes, and she had a very, her theology was really tied to the idea of a gender expansive Jesus and seeing Jesus as both feminine and masculine. So her sermons have just recently been translated into English from Spanish. So now you can read her sermons if you're interested. They're great. So knowing this about trans folks, knowing a little bit about trans communities and the language that we can use, let's talk for a second about ways that we can support our trans siblings. How does this actually work out in practice? So a couple things to not say to trans folks, right? First of all, have you had the surgery? First of all, there's no such thing as the surgery, because there's many different kinds of surgeries. But asking about people's bodies, and their medical history is generally not a thing that we want to do, right? We wouldn't ask people about what's in their pants if we didn't think that they were trans. We wouldn't ask them about their surgery or their plans for surgery. So just be aware of like other people's bodily autonomy and don't ask them stuff like that. What's your real name or what was your birth name? First of all, what's your real name assumes that the name they gave you isn't real, so that's not great. But then just generally asking about people's birth names generally isn't a thing to do, because not because trans people are like trying to hide anything, but because lots of trans people have sometimes very traumatic histories with their birth name. They may have family members, like I have family members who specifically still use my birth name because they're trying to make a point about like, they don't think I should be trans, they don't think I am trans, and they will use the wrong name intentionally to like make that point. And so lots of trans people will have a pretty negative history with their birth name. Not everybody, but lots. And so it's not the kind of thing that you just like want to bring up in a coffee shop sometime. Looking out for backhanded compliments, right? So I never would have guessed, or you look great for a trans person. What you're trying to say is, you don't look like I thought a trans person would look, or like I never would have guessed and isn't that great. And both of those things are problematic, because what you're essentially saying is, one, I know what all trans people look like and I expect them to look a specific way and you should live up to my expectations. And also I expect trans people to not look as good. Like, you look great for a trans person. Well, great. What did you think all trans people look like? So thinking about our backhanded compliments there. And then thinking about ways that we sometimes put our own discomfort onto other people. Like, I'm fine with it, but I feel bad for her grandma. Like, her mom must be taking it so hard or whatever. Like, putting our concerns onto other people rather than owning them ourselves and working on them internally ourselves is an important thing to be aware of. So things you can ask trans people: what's your name? Can you remind me of your pronouns? One thing to think about with pronouns, which we're going to touch on in a second, is keeping an eye on whether you're asking people to tell you about like their pronouns and their identity in a safe place? Are you in a safe place for them to disclose that stuff or not? So for instance, I went out recently, because it's Halloween here today in the States. I went out recently to carve pumpkins with a friend of mine who's non-binary, and they got misgendered like by the person who was like selling us the pumpkins. And I thought about it for a second. I was like, okay, well, I could correct this person, but we're not really in a place where this friend of mine might feel safe right now, and they might not want to be intentional about like their pronouns or how they're addressed in a space that doesn't feel safe. So I took them aside and I said, hey, like, I just wanted to know, like, would you like me to correct this particular person while we're doing this thing? And they said, no, I don't really want to mess with it right now. I don't necessarily feel super safe. And so that's fine. So like, just be aware of when you ask people to disclose information, is it in a safe place or not? Asking, how can I support you with that? And then my favorite question, is there a good resource you'd recommend on that? So rather than asking a trans person to teach you all about their whole life when they're just trying to go, you know, have a coffee somewhere, rather than doing that, asking if there's a book or a movie or a documentary or a podcast or something that they think does a good job explaining it, and then you can learn on your own time without them having to teach you in that moment. Interrupting negative conversations. When you hear people talking negatively or speaking negatively about trans folks, what can you do about that? So it's a joke. If it's a joke, ask the person to explain why they think the joke is funny. And a lot of times that ends up having the person explain why they're being a jerk. So if they're telling a joke and the punchline is about, you know, like a man in a dress, like ask them, like, why is that funny to you? Like, well, because men, you know, men who wear dresses are girly. Yeah, like usually they'll end up kind of like talking themselves into a hole. So sometimes you can kind of have them do it themselves that way. Just straight up stating that what the person said isn't okay, and that it's not all right. You have to be ready for people who will push back and be like, can't you take a joke? But like just saying that something's not okay can sometimes just lay a baseline of expectation. Setting a boundary, saying things like, I don't want to be around people who say stuff like that, essentially saying like, if this conversation is going to continue, I'm leaving. Setting a boundary about like what you will and will not be part of. Sometimes people say things, saying negative things, and they don't really know what they're talking about or they're saying, and it's just from ignorance. So offering alternatives. So if somebody uses a word that is negative or that they shouldn't be using, offering an alternative. And one of the sort of like, as you're helping people understand this, that like maybe they're not intentionally being mean, they just don't know any better, is you can explain using yourself as an example. And this is one of the things that I find works really well. So if somebody says something that they shouldn't have said, you can say like, well, you know, I used to think that too, or I used to say that word, and then I learned that, you know, this is why we shouldn't say that word, or then I learned that that actually wasn't true, and now I do this instead. And using yourself as an example takes the pressure off of them, so they don't feel like you're attacking them, but it gives them an example of like, oh, okay, I guess that's not a thing that we're doing anymore. So using yourself as an example can be a helpful way into these conversations. Pronouns, we've gotten better about this in a lot of spaces, talking about pronouns and what kind of pronouns to use for people. Lots of different languages in the world have a gender neutral third pronoun. In English, we're very used to masculine pronouns and feminine pronouns, and we don't think that we have a third person pronoun, but we do. It's they, them, theirs, a third person gender neutral pronoun. It's something that's been used for a long time. Like there's been a lot of talk about it recently, but there's actually some really great sort of precedents for this in Chaucer, in Shakespeare, and Jane Austen, of using they, them, and their as a singular pronoun for like a gender neutral singular pronoun. It's something that does show up in older English writing. So it's not new. We're thinking about it differently now. So there are also other gender neutral options besides they, them, theirs. So we've got some examples here. Z, they, and fey are all sort of gender neutral options that some people might use. The thing about pronouns that you're not familiar with is that it takes practice to get them right. And so if you're looking at this going, I am never going to remember to use those pronouns, it's literally just building new neural pathways in your brain. And the only way that that happens is through practice. So if you are somebody that has not been used to using they, them as a singular pronoun in your life, I'd start with that one and try to work on that one. And the way that I will practice, if it's a pronoun I'm not familiar with, is when I'm driving in the car or when I'm in the shower or like when I'm by myself, because you actually have to say it with your mouth for your brain to create those neural pathways. That's why we tell kids to say their flashcards out loud. So saying it with your mouth helps your brain remember. So I'll practice, and you can practice with a friend too. Practice talking about somebody, and saying like, yeah, they came and got their bag today. Tomorrow we're going to the zoo and they are really excited to see the lions. I can't wait to go with them, right? So like just practicing sentences like that, and practicing that kind of thing is meaningful, because then when you get it right with the person, they know that you really care. Using somebody's correct pronouns is about showing that you love them and care about them the way they are, that you see them as they are. And they do the same thing for you, right? They don't use the wrong pronouns for you. So thinking about using the right pronouns is a way to love our neighbor as ourselves. Last couple things here, using inclusive language in our community. So a lot of times when we're talking about groups of people, we will use gendered language that doesn't always include, for instance, non-binary folks. And the reason that this is important, the reason using inclusive language is important, is because when we use language that assumes that everybody in the room is either male or female, and cisgender male or female usually, the reason that's a problem is because it asks people unconsciously to hide, to not take up space. It tells them subconsciously that maybe they shouldn't even be there. So using inclusive language to say, you are here, you are welcome, we see you, and we want you to participate is huge. So in music, you can change from men and women to low voices and high voices, which is a lot more descriptive of what we actually are talking about. In church, you can say, instead of things like brothers and sisters, you can move to siblings, or just add that on. If you want to say brothers and sisters, that's great. You just say brothers and sisters and siblings, and then you just have it, then you include everybody. Instead of ladies and gentlemen, there's all kinds of different words that are gender neutral that you can use in sort of a work setting. In school, trying students or class, or here we've got, 8th graders or whatever, but grade 5s, or however you want to say it, like using gender neutral ways of addressing class at school. And then there's all kinds of gender neutral terms that you can use in everyday life. So parents, guardian, sibling, child, young adult, spouse, partner, folks, friends, people, and then y'all, which is of course specific to the States, but y'all is a great word and everybody should use it. That's my stamp of approval. So inclusive language is important. So what top sort of 7 things you can do for individuals? Keep getting educated, use inclusive language, practice interrupting negative conversation, be vocal about your support, get involved in policy change, and I've got a couple of links for y'all, offering to help gender expansive people navigate possibly unsafe spaces. So things like bathrooms can be a real stressful place for trans people. And so going with somebody, asking if they want somebody to go with them to the bathroom can be helpful to just like make sure that they're okay and that nobody's bothering them. Donating to organizations headed by gender expansive people. And then for churches, including trans people in church leadership, educating leaders and greeters, creating gender inclusive facilities, using inclusive language, having a welcome statement and non-discrimination policy, redistributing resources to trans people through donations and partnerships with local orgs, and then regularly including resources and theology related to gender diversity in preaching, Bible studies, youth curricula, etc. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put a couple of links. I think what I'll do is put them in the Facebook chat, or maybe I'll put them in the Zoom chat. I don't know which is better. But I've got a link for further reading if you want to learn more. And feel free to check out Transmission Ministry Collective if you are a trans person that wants to talk with other trans people about faith.
Great.
Thanks so much, Austen. That was wonderful. We're going to take a 5-minute break here and just take some time to get a few questions together for you, if that's okay. So folks in the room have some little things on the table. You can write your questions and stick them on that board. And we're going to try to synthesize them so we get the most out of the question time. And if you're on Facebook Live, just take the next couple of minutes to write your questions. And we'll be back in just 5 minutes. Just take a little stand-up break, grab a drink, use lube.
Sounds good.
So for those online, we'll reconvene at 4:15. That's okay with you.